To care for his youngest son, who was suffering from tuberculosis, Dan moved his family to this dry, arid farm, but on this night, someone set fire to their barn. Seeing the barn engulfed in flames, Dan immediately rushed outside. The moment he stepped out the door, however, he was ambushed and knocked to the ground. Having lost his left leg in the war, he relied on a prosthetic that needed to be strapped in place for him to stand. The arsonist approached and issued a warning: pay back the money, or they would burn his house next. Before Dan could put on his prosthetic, his eldest son, William, had already run toward the barn to save what he could. Inside were the horses, vital to any family in the West. The fire raged higher and fiercer, but William kept charging toward the barn. Dan grabbed him tightly, refusing to let his son risk his life. All they could do was watch helplessly as the last of their feed went up in flames, reduced to ashes. But William, young and brimming with anger, was not about to let it go. He picked up a shotgun from the ground and aimed at the retreating arsonist. Dan quickly snatched the shotgun out of his hands, telling him to stop. William saw his father as cowardly and looked down on him. Even Dan's wife harbored resentment toward him. Yet Dan couldn't explain his struggles to his family. The years of drought had forced him to take out high-interest loans just to keep the farm running. He couldn't afford to take risks, so he endured every hardship silently. After washing up, Dan took the children out to search for the cattle that had broken loose the night before. William still harbored resentment toward his father.
You gonna hawk that?
Someday, William. You walk in my shoes, you might understand.
I ain't ever walking in your shoes.
Though Dan remained outwardly calm, William's words had struck a nerve. Even so, Dan didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he slowly stood up and delivered a merciful shot to the injured steer lying on the ground. The gunshot echoed through the valley, catching the attention of Wade, the leader of a group of horse-riding outlaws. But Wade had no time to dwell on it. His crew was focused on robbing a payroll wagon belonging to the railroad company. 6 sleek black horses pulled a moving fortress, an armored carriage outfitted with a mounted semi-automatic machine gun at the rear. Up front sat the driver and the squad's commander, while the carriage itself concealed 2 armed guards ready to fire at a moment's notice. The outlaws had a sniper in position, and their attack began as they suddenly appeared in front of the wagon, opening fire. Fortunately for the railroad crew, the rough gallop of the bandits' horses threw off their aim. But Byron, an experienced sniper, can overcome this difficulty. He takes a deep breath and takes aim. The machine gunner at the rear of the wagon unleashed a storm of suppressing fire. The machine gun fire from the back row should not be underestimated, but fortunately snipers were arranged in advance to target them. One of the guards inside the wagon reacted quickly, turning his fire on the sniper, forcing him to retreat. Byron, however, capitalized on the chaos and managed to take down another target. Seeing that this was not going to work, Wade drove a herd of beef cattle from the hillside to charge the speeding armored truck. By the time Byron ordered the wagon to stop, it was already too late. The sudden swerve to avoid the stampeding cattle put excessive pressure on the wooden front left wheel, which cracked and gave way. The wagon lost balance, careened into a roadside slope, and flipped over, throwing its passengers violently. Charlie, the gang's second-in-command, quickly dismounted to inspect the crash site. As he scanned the wreckage, he spotted one of the guards attempting to flee. Calmly drawing his pistol, Charlie took aim. Without the instability of a galloping horse, his accuracy was deadly. The fleeing guard fell to the ground with a single, precise shot. Now, only Byron was left standing. Having dealt with Byron for years, Wade decided to let him go this time. As for the payroll wagon, the easiest solution was, of course, to throw in some dynamite. With a deafening explosion, a whole chest containing hundreds of dollars in cash became their haul for the day. Dan and his family, following the cattle tracks, happened to stumble upon the area. It turned out the herd of cattle from earlier were the ones that had escaped from their farm the night before. At that moment, one of the guards, who wasn't quite dead, suddenly emerged from the wreckage. Wade gestured for his men to lower their weapons this time. He would handle it himself. One of the gang members they had taken hostage realized what was coming from the look in Wade's eyes. He shot one of his own comrades. Wade and Charlie immediately spun around to check the reactions of the other gang members. Once they were sure there was no dissent, they walked over slowly. Standing over the wounded man, Wade coldly explained, "This is the price of putting the crew in danger." Seeing the outlaws' ruthless actions, Dan quickly whispered to his children, urging them to quietly retreat. But as they moved, the sound of a horse's hoof striking loose gravel gave them away. In an instant, Wade was in front of them, Unlike his usual timid demeanor, Dan stood protectively in front of his children this time, facing Wade. He declared, "Those cattle belong to me. I just want them back." For reasons unknown, Wade agreed. However, he demanded they temporarily hand over their horses to prevent them from running off to report the robbery. He promised to leave them by the roadside on the way to the nearest town once they were done. To William, though, this was just another display of his father's cowardice. Upon arriving in town, Charlie stole a coat off a drunken man slumped on the street, adjusting his hat to complete the disguise. He transformed himself into an ordinary ranch hand and strolled into the railroad company's police station, feigning concern. He told the detectives that he had witnessed a payroll wagon being robbed on his way over. He claimed the ringleader was none other than the notorious local outlaw, Wade. Hearing this, the detectives grabbed their weapons and rushed out in full force. But the gang's goal wasn't just to toy with the police, it was also to pay their respects at the saloon for the comrades they'd lost in the robbery and to divide the loot. While the gang reveled, Wade's eyes lingered on the saloon's barmaid. Charlie, recognizing the look on his leader's face, quietly urged him to stay focused, warning that the detectives weren't fools and would be back soon. But seeing Wade unmoved, Charlie sighed and told him he would wait nearby with the rest of the crew. Wade had encountered this woman before in another town. Her striking green eyes, which he believed represented a rare purity in his tumultuous world. When she denied having such eyes, Wade didn't relent. Instead, he pulled her into his arms. Meanwhile, Dan, busy trying to rescue someone, heard the distant thunder of approaching hooves. It was the detectives, tricked into leaving town. After Dan recounted everything he'd witnessed, the detectives exchanged uneasy glances and instantly understood they'd been duped. Wade saw the returning police officer through the window. Instead of panicking, he smiled. He had just finished sketching the barmaid's portrait and told her he planned to cross the border into Mexico, a land where no one had placed a bounty on his head. He expressed a wish to have her by his side someday. The barmaid, however, dismissed it as a joke.
You're crazy.
As the detectives began to surround the saloon, Dan, following his original plan, sought out his creditor to plead for more time. The man, indifferent to Dan's desperation, sent his enforcer, Tucker, to join the operation to capture Wade at the saloon. Seeing no way to negotiate, Dan offered his most cherished possession, a gemstone-encrusted medal. He begged for just a few months' extension, promising to repay the debt in full by the coming spring, but the creditor dismissed him with scorn, refusing to grant any leniency.
Sometimes a man has to be big enough to see how small he is. Railroad's coming, Dan. Your land's worth more with you off it.
Once again, Dan's dignity was trampled underfoot. With his family's survival hanging by a thread, the man who had spent his life retreating from conflict found himself with no room left to retreat. A small, downtrodden man at the bottom of society finally decided to take up arms to defend his family and his last shred of dignity.
Hollander!
But instead of finding his creditor, Dan encountered Wade, who was preparing to leave town. Sensing that Dan was troubled, Wade struck up a casual conversation while pulling out some cash to ease his worries. As Dan noticed the detectives quietly closing in outside, he decided to stall for time by making excessive demands. Until Wade's arrest, Wade's record was staggering: 22 robberies, $400,000 stolen, and damages far exceeding that amount. The railroad company's executives resolved to send him to the state capitol for a public trial and hanging to set an example, but despite their willingness to pay handsomely, they still needed one more man for the job. That's when Dan stepped forward.
I was best shot in my regiment. I'll come. For $200.
$200 would not only clear his debts but also revive his struggling farm. Yet the task ahead was perilous. They would face Wade's ruthless gang. The danger became apparent as soon as they left the saloon, receiving warning signals from Wade's men.
This town's gonna burn!
The sheriff decided to regroup at Dan's farm before making further plans. During the transport, Charlie kept a watchful distance, waiting for the perfect moment to rescue Wade. The wagon carrying Wade became stuck near the farm gate. Dan grabbed his tools and joined two guards to help free the wheel, taking advantage of the wagon's position to block Charlie's line of sight. One of the guards swapped Wade's hat and disguised himself to sit in the wagon in Wade's place. This sleight of hand, carried out under Charlie's observation, bought valuable time for the transport team. The plan was to head to their real destination after having dinner at Dan's house. At this point, Wade suddenly changed his previous frivolous attitude, because he noticed that Dan's wife Alice had green eyes, exactly like a girl he once knew. Dan, growing uneasy, interrupted the conversation and called Alice into another room. He didn't want his wife getting too close to someone as dangerous as Wade. Alice, however, couldn't understand why Dan insisted on taking such a risky job. Finally, they both spoke their minds.
And Wade has a gang, and they're out there tonight, somewhere.
If I don't go, we gotta pack up and leave. Heading God knows where without a prayer, Durbar. Now I'm tired, Alice. I am tired of watching my boys go hungry. I'm tired of the way that they look at me. I'm tired of the way that you don't. I've been standing on one leg for 3 damn years, waiting for God to do me a favor. And he ain't listening.
Dan had reached his breaking point. He was determined to seize this opportunity to change his life, no matter the cost. Unbeknownst to him, his son William also wanted to face his fears and avoid future regrets. Quietly, William told his younger brother to stay put, grabbed a weapon, and slipped out through a window, determined to secretly join his father on this perilous adventure. Since the group had to camp outdoors, someone needed to stand guard to ensure everyone's safety. But when it was Tucker's turn, things took a dark turn.
Gonna hang me in the morning, for the night is done. You're gonna hang me in the morning, I'll never see the sun. I suppose it's too much to ask for a little quiet.
His reasoning was simple: if he couldn't sleep, then no one else should either. This petty mindset, however, ended up costing him his life. While the others were sound asleep, Wade used a dining fork to stab Tucker through the neck. The act enraged Byron, the leader. Even as a captive, Wade had the audacity to commit murder right under his nose, a blatant sign of disrespect. Furious, Byron prepared to retaliate, but the railroad official quickly drew his gun to stop him, fearing the situation would spiral further. Yet Byron didn't relent, his anger only growing. Finally, Dan intervened, stepping forward to pull Byron away. The next morning, Dan questioned Wade. "Why did you only kill Tucker? Why not me or anyone else?" Wade's answer left him stunned. "He shouldn't have taken my horse." It turned out that when they left Dan's farm, Tucker had stolen Wade's horse.
No. This is my horse now.
A slight that earned him a place on Wade's hit list. Tensions rose further as Byron and Wade exchanged heated words. Byron warned Wade to wipe the smug grin off his face, reminding him he would be hanged by tomorrow and sent straight to hell. Wade, unbothered, retorted, "Even if I go to hell, I'll rise again." The comment pushed Byron over the edge. He took advantage of Byron's moment of inattention, grabbed him and pulled him off his horse, then knocked him unconscious. Before anyone could react, Wade grabbed Byron's rifle. His justification was chillingly simple: even bad men respect their mothers. With that, he shoved Byron off the cliff into the abyss below. The rest of the people stood still, and Wade took no action against them. But just as he was about to leave, someone suddenly appeared behind him.
Don't you move, Mr. Wade. Let go of that shotgun.
William, what the hell are you doing here?
I don't think you're gonna shoot a man you admire in the back of the head, boy. Dan, tell your boy it's over.
You think you can keep your gun on him, will you?
I'm doing a damn sight better than you did.
One is the outlaw he admires, the other was the father William looked down on. Yet in the face of right and wrong, William made the correct choice. That night, they were ambushed again, and Dan was taken down with just 2 shots. Wade picked up Dan's revolver and carefully aimed, using the gunfire to determine that the attackers numbered 3, but they weren't part of his gang. Ignoring Dan's shouts, Wade began to strategize a counterattack. Using the tall grass for cover, he silently crept toward the hillside. It turned out the ambushers were Native Americans from a nearby tribe, but when the gunfire ceased and Wade emerged armed, they soon realized that Wade was more dangerous than they were. Surprisingly, Wade didn't harm them. Instead, he demanded Dan hand over the key to his handcuffs and promised to part ways. Dan took out the keys in his pocket. Just as Wade reached for them, he threw them back into the dark grass. Naturally, this defiance came with consequences. When Dan woke up, he found Wade had already escaped. Butterfield suggested abandoning the pursuit. but Dan adamantly refused. If Wade wasn't delivered to the destination, Dan wouldn't receive his commission. Meanwhile, Wade, now on horseback, made his way to a nearby Chinese labor camp. The foreman there happened to know Wade, but their relationship was far from friendly. It wasn't long before Dan and his group arrived here, and they happened to encounter the foreman torturing Wade. They were both in charge of the railway company and knew each other, and they wanted to take Wade with them, but the other party didn't seem to give them face. After exchanging subtle glances, Dan and Butterfield decided to strike first, catching the laborers off guard. During the chaotic escape, Wade managed to grab a bundle of dynamite and conceal it. After they passed through a tunnel, Wade tossed the dynamite into the air, and Dan shot it mid-flight, causing an explosion that cut off their pursuers. Unfortunately, the doctor in their group was struck by shrapnel in the chest and succumbed to his injuries. Finally, their destination, contention, came into view. By now, the group transporting Wade had dwindled to just Butterfield, Dan, and his son. All they needed to do was hold out until 3:10, when the train bound for Yuma would arrive to take Wade into custody. To ensure everything went smoothly, Butterfield paid the local sheriff and a group of deputies to assist them. Before long, Charlie and the gang arrived in town. The decoy wagon sent in the opposite direction hadn't gotten far before they caught up and seized it. Under Charlie's threats and persuasion, the fake prisoner quickly spilled the details of the plan.
Contention! All right! They're going to contention! We're gonna put him on the 310! The Yuma prison! Tomorrow!
With the true destination now clear, Charlie prepared to move immediately. However, some members of the gang hesitated. They argued that Wade's capture was his own fault, and it wasn't worth breaking their code or risking their lives to save him. This defiance hit a nerve with Charlie. Charlie immediately had a plan when he found out that Wade was staying in the hotel. He wasn't foolish enough to storm the place directly, though, figuring that the group guarding Wade would eventually have to come out. To leave no room for failure, he offered a bounty, $200 for anyone who could shoot a guard. This was no small sum, and nearly everyone in town who knew how to handle a gun stepped up to the task. Seeing the overwhelming number of opponents, the sheriff panicked. He had no interest in fighting a hopeless battle. Despite Butterfield's desperate pleas, the sheriff stood by his decision to surrender. What he didn't expect was that he surrendered with his men and surrendered their guns. But Charlie and the others didn't seem to intend to reciprocate at all. Seeing this, Butterfield no longer insisted. With the father and son Dan and him having no chance of survival, he advised Dan to give up. Butterfield, he said, there's no way you, me, or your son make it out alive if we fight. Even Wade chimed in, advising Dan to recognize when to cut his losses and walk away. For the first time, even William, who had always seen his father as weak, suggested they retreat and go home. But after thinking about it,
What did Doc Potter give his life for, William? McElroy.
Little red ants on a hill.
I'll pay you the 200, Dan, right now, and you can walk away.
he said that this remark hit Dan where it hurt. The government had given him $200 as compensation for losing his left foot in the war. As he reflected on it now, he wondered, was that money truly a way to help him move on, or just a convenient bribe to make the government feel better about abandoning him? He has already decided to see Wade to the bus stop, but when his son says he wants to stay with him, he insists that the son go home with Butterfield. For the first time, Dan stood before William as a father, a man, and a hero.
And you just remember, it's your old man. Walk them way to that station.
Outside, snipers were already in position. Now, it was just him and Wade left, clutching his pocket watch. Dan's hands trembled uncontrollably. Wade, casually sketching, tried to calm him down, saying, "Don't get too nervous, or you'll mess up." The earlier conversation had shifted Wade's view of this country bumpkin. As a child, Wade's father had died from alcoholism, and his mother abandoned him at a train station. Watching Dan use his life to teach his son a lesson about courage and sacrifice, Wade decided to help Dan achieve his dream. During this final escort, Wade didn't take the chance to escape. Instead, he cooperated fully, even warning Dan when someone was sneaking up behind them.
Dan.
But the hired gunmen outside were indiscriminate, firing wildly at both sides. Dan's shooting skills, despite his boasts, weren't exceptional. He could only hit targets that were either stationary or very close. When Wade asked him about their next move, Dan admitted he had no plan. At this rate, they would both be riddled with bullets before long. Ironically, Charlie, noticing the gunman's reckless shooting endangered Wade, stepped in and reduced the pressure on them. Seizing the moment of reduced fire, Dan kicked over a nearby barrel and moved forward with Wade toward a storefront. As Wade pushed the door open, a sniper who had been lying in wait shot him in the hand. Though Dan avenged him immediately, Wade was furious. He made his feelings clear, but Dan wouldn't back down. A heated confrontation ensued, with Wade easily overpowering Dan and pinning him to the ground. It wasn't until Wade was about to strangle him that he revealed the real reason why he wouldn't give up.
I had never been no hero, Wade. Only battle I seen. We was in retreat. My foot got shot off by one of my own men. You try telling that story to your boy. See how he looks at you then.
This time, Wade was truly moved. He decided to help Dan finish this dream, but also to fulfill his own longing for the fatherly love he missed as a child. To make it more convincing, he led Dan across rooftops, evading his own gang's pursuit. It became a story of a small man's last stubborn stand and an outlaw's path to redemption. William clutched the keepsake his father had given him, his gaze wavering. In the end, he couldn't bear to leave his father behind, so he pushed Butterfield out of the way and rushed out. With Wade's full support, Dan and William moved closer and closer to the train station. Dan's face was lit up with a smile, the kind of fulfillment he had never felt before. Dodging bullets while firing back, Dan moved like a true hero, battling a gang of outlaws. Even when he was shot by Charlie before he walked onto the platform, the smile on his face never disappeared. Now all that remained was for the train to arrive and for Wade to board it. With that, Dan's mission would finally be complete. As they waited for the train, Wade told Dan something unexpected. He had escaped from the Yuma prison more than once. He admitted this so Dan wouldn't feel guilty about accepting his help, and was also one of the reasons why he felt confident along the way and decided to accompany Dan in the play. The train arrived, but by now, the station was completely surrounded by outlaws. Meanwhile, William had sneaked behind the gang and, seeing an opportunity, unlocked a gate to let a herd of cattle storm the battlefield. The chaos gave Dan the time he needed. Seeing his son's signal, Dan gained confidence. Under the cover of the stampeding cattle, he and Wade charged forward. For the first time, Dan became a true hero in the eyes of his son. What seemed like the perfect ending to their story took an unexpected turn. Charlie and his men were just as determined to rescue their leader. Wade, jumping off the train, felt conflicted as he looked at Dan, a father he had come to admire. When Charlie tossed Wade his signature pistol, Wade decided to finish the story the way Dan deserved and to bring his own journey to an end. By the time Charlie sensed something was wrong and noticed the cold determination in Wade's eyes, it was already too late. All 6 of his men lay dead, killed by Wade's unerring aim. This is the story of 3:10 to Yuma, a 2007 remake of the 1957 classic. The ending, where Wade kills the gang members who came to rescue him, has long been seen as abrupt and puzzling by many viewers. But if you think about the details, it makes perfect sense. At its heart, it's a story of irreconcilable values. Charlie and his gang killed Dan, not just a farmer, but someone who symbolized the childhood Wade longed for and the regrets he could never undo. In the film's final moments, William crouches beside his father, watching as Wade boards the train, ensuring Dan's mission is complete. If you look closely at William's eyes, you'll notice they green. I'm a movie enthusiast. Did you understand the film? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.